To me, it's ironic that the Westminster Confession says that God created everything in the space of 6 days, and yet entombed in the floor of Westminster Chapel are the earthly remains lying in a state of honor of Charles Darwin. Our Christian forefathers read Genesis chapter 1, 5, and chapters 11, understanding that God had said that he created everything in 6 days about 6,000 years ago. He even said it from Mount Sinai out loud. In 6 days, Yahweh created the heavens and the earth and all that in them is, and rested on the seventh day. The irony of the fundamentalist movement in America is that from its inception and still today, many of its best-known proponents, all men of God, whose ministries I admire, while standing ferociously for the inerrancy of Scripture, reject what God says about the 6 days of creation. Men like Pat Robertson of CBN, James Dobson, Focus on the Family, John Ankerberg Show, Dr. Jeffress, pastor of First Baptist Church, Dallas, all accept 13.7 billion years ago for the Big Bang and the progressive creationism taught by Hugh Ross. I was taught theistic evolution and the day-age theory in Hardin-Simmons in Abilene, a Baptist university. I know several young men who went to Baylor University to be pastors and came out atheists. Well-known pastor of Redeemer Presbyterian Church in New York City, Tim Keller, gets around the million years in Genesis chapter 1 by saying it's just poetry. Well, blindness in part has happened to the fundamentalist movement, because if God did not create 6 days, 6,000 or a few thousand years ago, then death was the original condition of people and of life. It was not the result of Adam's sin. Death did not come into the world through sin. And if Jesus' death was anything more than a fable, it had no meaning. And while fundamentalists can't seem to see that that's a problem, the rest of the world certainly does. Richard Bosarth wrote in 1978, Christianity has fought, still fights, and will continue to fight science to the desperate end over evolution, because evolution destroys utterly and finally the very reason Jesus' life was made necessary. Destroy Adam and Eve, an original sin, and in the rubble you find the sorry remains of the Son of God. It is the number one reason people old and young give for rejecting the Bible and leaving the church. Billy Graham's close friend, Charles Templeton, a Youth for Christ evangelist, left Christianity in 1948. He said, Billy, it's simply not possible any longer to believe, for instance, the biblical account of creation. The world wasn't created over a period of days a few thousand years ago. It evolved over millions of years. It's not a matter of speculation. It's demonstrable fact. And sadly, 30-year-old Billy Graham could say nothing to dissuade his friend, because he also believed in millions of years. Billy Graham at the time was a president of Northwestern Bible Institute, where they taught theistic evolution. Dr. Riley, who began Northwestern and who was a staunch beginner of the fundamentalist movement, believed in theistic evolution. And he's the one who got William Jennings Bryan to champion the fundamentalist movement and prosecute the Scopes monkey trial in 1925. And yet, on the stand, Bryan was made a fool of by Clarence Darrow when it was exposed that when Bryan said he believed in the Bible, he did not believe in a 6-day creation, but believed in millions of years. Famous fundamentalist Charles Hodge gave this feeble excuse. It is, of course, admitted that taking Genesis by itself, it would be most natural to understand the word day in its normal sense. But if that brings the Mosaic account into conflict with facts, but other interpretations avoid such conflict, then it's obligatory to us to adopt the other. B.B. Warfield, his protege, even accepted Darwinism. But thankfully, in recent decades, there has been a return among fundamentalists and evangelicals to the Genesis account. I like the story Ken Ham tells about a pastor's wife who came up to him after he spoke one night and said, well, I don't limit God. I believe he could have created by evolution if he wanted to. And Ken Ham replied, well, I don't limit God either, but I do limit myself to what God said he did. In John chapter 10, Jesus said the scripture cannot be wrong, and over he confirms in the New Testament the writings of Moses. He says to the two on the road to Emmaus, "O fools and slow of heart to believe all that the prophets have written," and beginning at Moses. In John chapter 5, Jesus said, "If you don't believe Moses, how can you believe me?" He said to the rich man in Hades, who was in torments, and said to him, if they won't believe Moses, they won't believe somebody who came back from the dead. Recently, a young earth creationist pointed out to a Biologos spokesman that in Matthew chapter 19 and in Mark chapter 10, that Jesus said that God created man and woman at the very beginning of creation, not after billions of years of evolution. And the Logos spokesman said, yeah, but he didn't know as much science as we know. Is it any wonder that the church is in decline in America?